Last week, we talked about sneakers that changed the game. This week, we're going to talk about sneaker models that influence the game, this time on Fire Footwear. Welcome back to Fire Footwear, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Frates. I hope this finds you well. I want to thank you for tuning in this week. And before we get started on this week's topic, I do want to talk about something because while this podcast is an escape from regular life, we love sneakers, all that good stuff, I talk a lot about the fact that my real life, the life that I lead outside of this podcast, is going to come into play every once in a while. And so this week has been very trying for me because as much as I would like to focus on the good things in life, I had jury duty this week, and I was, I guess you could say, fortunate enough to be selected for a jury, but I was selected for a murder trial. And it has been quite a week. It's been an eye-opening experience to see how other people see the world, to see what happens inside of a courtroom, to see what happens behind the scenes as it relates to somebody who has been convicted or charged with a crime that maybe they didn't commit. And so going through all that process has deeply affected me this week. But I am looking forward to getting back to this because this really is an escape from all of that. And I want to get back to last week where I started a new series that is all about changing the game. And I talked about sneaker models that changed the game. And we talked about the Converse Chuck All-Star, the Nike Waffle Racer, the Air Force One, the Jordan 1, the Jordan 3, and the Yeezy 350. That's subjective, obviously. People can make arguments that other models may have had more of an influence or more changed the game. But when I look at the models that we are given and have been given over the course of history, those are the ones that stand out to me as ones that really changed the game in a fundamental way. Along the way, though, there have been a ton of other shoes that have come out, a ton of other models that have debuted over the course of the very long history that is now considered sneaker history. And so even though those 6 models last week I felt changed the game fundamentally, there have been many others that have come out that have really influenced the game to the way that we know it today. And I want to start with a model that everybody knows about that debuted in 1950. It's one we have talked about. It is one that is currently going through a moment. However, that moment does not define the entirety of the history of the shoe, and that is the Adidas Samba. You got to think about where we were in 1950. Adidas had just come on the map. Adidas was trying to find a foothold, no pun intended, in the athletic space. And the Adidas Samba was a shoe that really was a precursor to where we are today in the fact that it started out as an athletic shoe, and now it is a shoe that everyone has to have. And almost everybody at some form or fashion has owned an Adidas Samba. The 3 stripes are prominent. Its look is seen in athletic competitions all over the world. And I'm not just talking about the Samba itself, but the look and the aesthetic that the Samba started with the 3 stripes, that branding. It's something we all know in sneaker culture, and it's something that even casual people know. But it has become adopted by soccer over the years. And I know as I was growing up, I saw it solely as a shoe for people who played soccer. Soccer is the most popular sport on the entire planet. It's why it's called the beautiful game, why it's called the world's game. And so it's going to have a mass appeal to a lot of people. It's certainly going to have a lot of exposure. And that exposure, I think, has lasted the test of time to where maybe the Samba had a little bit of a dip in its popularity. It still stayed popular in athletic spaces. Now, though, it has had a moment that has been almost 3 years running. But like I said, don't let that 3-year period define what has been a very rich history that has influenced the game of the Adidas Samba. Let's move forward to 1965, another Adidas model, and this is the Adidas Superstar Pro model. This was Adidas's first basketball shoe, and it's one that incorporated leather. And it was an attempt at giving basketball shoes a little bit more of a durability, especially with that shell toe. And ironically, the Superstar ended up becoming a huge hit because of Run DMC, but this is something that started as a basketball model. So this, again, like the Samba, something that started in the athletic realm, the technological advances it was trying to bring to the forefront ended up becoming an influence for people that were not related to sports at all. It really continued in its popularity, I'm talking about just the superstar in general, through that nu metal rap rock phase, especially with Fred Durst. And it's something that you see today still. I don't think it's quite as popular, but it has stood the test of time. And I think you got to look back to the Run DMC days where that rap and sneaker connection is really what started a whole different level of collaborations, a whole different level of popularity. And it really started back in that 1965 period with the introduction of that Pro model. Now, if you move 4 years into the future, 1969, we're talking the Onitsuka Tiger Corsair, and I probably mispronounced that. But this really was the birth of modern running shoes. And it was the inspiration for a shoe we all know very well, and that is the Nike Cortez. It caught on with streetwear when it was used in Kill Bill, and it used like Bruce Lee's sort of color scheme with the black and the yellow. But it really was an inspiration for an entire brand, and that was Nike. So while the Waffle Racer was the actual start, I think that this Corsair was actually the inspiration for it. And you could make the argument that it was obviously the birth of Asics, but it really was the birth of modern running shoes. And now modern running shoes are part of the game. You see a lot of Asics, a lot of New Balances in the game, and it probably was because of that moment and that particular model. Moving to 1976, the Converse Pro Leather. It was an all-leather basketball shoe that matched the league's play stylistically and aesthetically at the time. It was cool, it was a high top, it was hip, and the game was a lot different back then. Dr. J really revolutionized this shoe in terms of athletes that wore it, and the inclusion of leather on a basketball shoe was sparse until that point, and now it is a staple. So that 100% influenced athletic wear going forward, and obviously athletic wear and streetwear stuff has now become synonymous with each other. So I think this is a pivotal moment. 1978, the Vans Skate High. And I ask a fundamental question with this shoe. Would there be a Nike SB without this shoe? Skateboarding culture was something that was a niche, and the Skate High was intentionally created for skateboarders, which had broke a trend of basically using boat shoes as skateboarding shoes to that point. So maybe this wasn't the very first Van, but this model in particular changed the game and paved the way for numerous skate shoe incarnations in the future. It certainly paved the way for the Nike Dunk High, certainly paved the way for all of those high top skate shoes you see today, and really importantly, it paved the way for the creation of Nike SB. So Vans really is the reason why Nike SB exists, and if you go back to that episode a couple of episodes ago, you now have a little bit more context as to why Nike SB is what it is and why skateboarding culture became so popular with sneakers at the time. 1982, the New Balance 990. And I joke here that dads around the world rejoiced when this shoe was dropped. But what has always been a dad shoe that middle-aged men cut the grass in is now an icon of today's sneaker world. So much so that people like Action Bronson are actually giving collaborations and design to this shoe. It combines function and fashion, and really nowadays is one of the most collaborated silhouettes on the market. New Balances in general are collaborated on as far as just all across the board, but this shoe I think in particular has a place, and not only the collaborations, but just the straight gray and white colorway. That's something that sneakerheads wear. It's something that hypebeasts wear now. This is not just a shoe for dads anymore, although I would make the argument that many sneakerheads today that are wearing this probably are dads, but it's not made specifically with them in mind. 1987. This is a model we've talked about before, and it just really, the history precedes it, the Air Max 1. The visible air unit, and it brought Tinker Hatfield to the playing field in sneaker design as a whole. It really reinvigorated running shoes at the time, and I think that it led to a lot of the new trends in running shoes in the sneaker game that you see today. It is obviously now considered a lifestyle shoe. I don't think anybody's going to go run in the Air Max 1, but back when it was created, it got Nike back in the running space, which is something that it had dominated before Jordan Brand ever came along, and the Air Max 1 took a lot of risks, both aesthetically and technologically, and I think that paved the way for a lot of things moving forward, including the Nike Air Trainer 1, the Nike Air Tech Challenge 2. This is when Nike started really turning to athletes that were not named Michael Jordan to endorse their products. Trainers became part of exercise culture, and then they became a staple in footwear brands all over. And we're talking about athletes' names like Bo Jackson, John McEnroe, Andre Agassi, that all came behind them. This is the day that the athlete was here to stay in sneakers, and now athletes almost are assumed in terms of their popularity that they're going to have a sneaker. When you have a new athlete come on the NBA from the draft, when that person becomes popular enough, they get a shoe. Caitlin Clark immediately gets a shoe, and that is because of this trend that started here, where athletes that were not basketball players, but tennis players, football players, baseball players, were all getting these collaborations. And it's because of this boom that came with these trainers that was starting to become a popular thing all over sneakers. But Nike certainly did a great job of making two models and some really, really awesome colorways that really influenced the game heavily. Now we're moving to 1993, and we are talking about a bathing ape. Now, obviously, Nigo hit a brand that has hit a massive home run since then, but the Bapesta, or however you say it, the Bape STA, I'm not even sure how to say it. I've never actually worn one. But this is a perfect example of imitation being the highest form of flattery. It could be credited as really the first mainstream custom, and dare I say, almost the first mainstream fake, because when you look at it, not knowing anything about the brand, if a shoe like that showed up today on some social media account or whatever, it would get absolutely raked over the coals for being a fake imitation of a shoe that everybody knows, and that is the Air Force One. But they rose to sneaker fame with this shoe because of the eclectic take that they had on the Air Force One Low. And the Air Force One Low is one of the most popular shoes of all time, and it really forced Nike to change their views because all the patent leather that was on it that Nigo had included, now Nike was starting to do that. And patent leather was something that we would see again in the future, but it really started here because of a brand that was not named Nike. But now we're moving to 1996, and we're talking about the Jordan 11, and that is all about patent leather. Michael Jordan is coming back to basketball. He is going to get his own shoe for the return, and there you have the Jordan 11, specifically the Concords, and people just went nuts over it. The Jordan 11 sells pretty well today. I would say that it's probably the third, maybe the second most popular Jordan of all time, and that's because of that patent leather back then. It just worked. Michael wanted something that he felt like he could wear with more formal wear, and that's what you got. And we just continued on that trend that Bape had actually built on 3 years prior. 1997, the Nike Air Foamposite. We did an entire episode on the show. Shout out to my man Julius, who was in that group chat. And this really was a technological change that led to other major changes that are seen in modern footwear today. It was a design unlike any other to that point. We're talking about trying to form fit a shoe to each individual's feet. That's something that I think they even still strive to make happen today with all of the foam and everything, but the Foamposite really made that happen. It was a model that ended up taking over the DC area. It still has a presence here. Penny Hardaway became synonymous with this shoe. Mike Bibby once wore this in the national championship game. It has a pretty steep history, and there have been a lot of releases that have made news related to the Foamposite. So I think the Foamposite certainly influenced the game, and maybe younger people in the culture today don't see it as a shoe they want to wear. But once upon a time, this shoe was heavily involved in sneaker culture, and I think even in the DC area, it still has a very heavy influence. And last but not least, we're going to talk about 2009 to 2012, and this is the Nike Air Yeezy 2. To me, this is one of the most coveted models that Kanye West ever created. And it was on the heels of his Louis Vuitton design, of course, but when he's with Nike, he uses some of the pieces of other shoes that we've actually mentioned in this video, and created the Nike Air Yeezy 1 and the Air Yeezy 2. But to me, the Air Yeezy 2 is the more influential of this model, because I think that it actually didn't influence sneakers in terms of design. I think it influenced sneakers in terms of drops, covetability, and I think resale. And the Red Octobers are one of the most talked about releases of all time because it happened in a tweet after Kanye had left the company. I think that that heavily influences the future because now people are so involved with these releases. They know exactly when they're going to happen. Shock drops are not even shocking anymore, but that was a true shock drop. And the influence that that shoe had in so many ways, I think influenced the game forever. And I don't believe that we have had a shoe come out, and I'm talking about a model that is really influenced in that way. You could make an argument for maybe the Yeezy 700, bringing back dad shoes again, and that's fair. The Yeezy 700 was panned by a lot of people, but I think it's one of the most comfortable shoes I've ever worn in my life. And so maybe by extension, that is influence. And that means that Kanye West has had a pretty decent influence on the sneaker game. By my calculation, he actually changed the game with the 350, influenced it with the Air Yeezy 2 and even the Yeezy 700. And I think that that is pretty impactful. And I honestly believe that a lot of these shoes you can lump into changing the game maybe, but I think they more influenced it because I think if you look at these shoes, they had a direct impact on things that would come in the future. And these are not colorways, and we're going to get into colorways in a future episode. These are just sneaker models that have influenced the game. And before we get to the end, we're going to get to the release of the week. Release of the week, where I like to highlight a shoe that has caught my eye. It's not always hype. Sometimes it is. It's just a shoe that I want you to know about. This week, we are going to go with a classic, and that is the Air Jordan 1 Low OG Shadow colorway. It releases on May 11th, so it will come out tomorrow for $140 if you are listening to this on Friday, May 10th. It's a classic look, a classic silhouette, a classic shoe. It's perfect for summer. It's perfect for winter. It is something you should have in your collection. The Air Jordan 1 Low OG is a great, great model, and this is your time to pick it up. So if it's something you want in your collection, you like the OG look, you like the vintage look, this is your time for $140. Sneakers that influence the game. What are some that you think that I missed? Do you agree with what I said? I would love to hear from you. Instagram, @FireFootwearPod is the handle. If you want to find me on TikTok, @FireFootwearPod is the handle. If you're a Facebook user and you want to post pictures to the Facebook page, Fire Footwear Sneaker Podcast is what you would search. If you want to watch the show on YouTube in some capacity, Fire Footwear, a sneaker podcast with Matty Ice is what you would search. Please, please, please support the Matty Ice Media Network, MattyIceMedia.com for the other podcasts that we have in support. And if you want to get in touch with me, firefootwearpod@gmail.com or @MattyIceFreights on Twitter are ways that you can do so. Hope this finds everybody well. I hope this finds everybody safe. I want to thank you for once again tuning into the show, and I'll talk to you next time. This is Fire Footwear. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Fire Footwear are those of Matt Fratescreations and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Fire Footwear is exclusively owned by Matt Fratescreations and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.